Hello, I am petroonishchuk. This video about URLSession, generic and database. In this video, we will create ICE project for make GET request and also for make POST request. In this video, we will work with web API and also with my local API. What I will be create with my local server. My local server I will create with Go language. And also in this video, we will work with couple database. SQLite database, MySQLite database and also PostgreSQL database. Okay, let's start. For start, I must create a new project. And first, in my project, I will create file for hold our model. For example, and now I explain what I create. First, how you can see, I create a new project. URLSession, generic and database. Inside this project, first I rename our content view to main content view. Will be our main content view. And also I create a model. Inside our file PageViewModel.swift, we create couple structure. First structure is our user structure. With this structure, we will hold our user object. How you can see, our structure hold couple property: ID, first name, last name, email, and avatar. And also we create coding keys enum for encode and decode our data. And also we have structure support. We create the structure for decode our page object. How you can see, our support structure called URL and text. And also I create a two initializer for our structure. This is default initializer for placeholder our URL and text. And also I create a custom initializer when we want to set our URL and text for our support object. And also we have our page structure. With page structure we will hold our page object. This page object will be downloaded from our web API. How you can see, our structure holds couple property: page, per page, total, total page, all users, and support. our property allUsers hold array of user objects, and our property support hold object support. And also we create coding keys enum for encoder and decoder our page object, and also we create a tool initializer, default initializer for placeholder our data in our page object. And also we create a custom initializer when we want to set value to property in our page object. And also we create a 3 enum. Word enum type of app URL. We'll be using this enum when we will be create our URL session. Later I show you where we'll be using this enum. And also we have enum type of search. We'll be using this enum where we will be search specific data from list of our data. And also we have enum MyRequestError. We'll be using this enum when we will be need a throw and specific error when we will be make our GET request and also when we will be make our POST request. Okay, this is our model. Next, what I want to create is our NetworkRequestService class. Through this class, we will make our GET request and also we will make our POST request. For example, And now let's see what I create. First, as you can see, I create a new file, NetworkRequestService file. Inside the file, we have a class, NetworkRequestService class. Through this class, we will make our GET request and also we will make our POST request. Inside our class, first we have a property shard. Through this property, we will run our method what we hold inside our NetworkRequestService class. And then, inside our class, first we have a method MyRequestURL. With this method, we will create a URL for our GET request and for our POST request. Our function MyRequestURL takes two parameters. First parameter is type of URL. For this parameter, we'll be using our enum, type of app URL. We'll be using this enum, what we create in our PageView file. And also we have parameter path to create our URL. And on the end, we return an URL or throw an error. Next, we use switch for check if variant from our type of app URL enum. How you can see, we using case for make a GET request from our web IP, for GET request from our localhost IP, and also for make a POST request for our localhost IP. On the first variant, we will make our URL for make a GET request from our web IP. First, how you can see, we're using URL component for create our URL using ham host path to our web IP, and also we're using query item for put query item to our URL page with value 2. And then we create our URL. When we have an error, we throw an error, and on the end, we return our URL if all successful. In the second variant, we will make our URL for make our GET request from our local server. How you can see, we're using this case, GET request localhost IP. Next, inside our case, we create our raw URL by using our URL string. Next, we create our components by using real components and also by using our URL. If we have an error, we throw an error. Next, we're using our URL component to add query item to our URL with name users with value of. Next, we create our URL from our URL components with our raw URL and also with our query items. And if all successful, we return URL. If we have an error, we throw an error. And next, we have a third query for make our POST request from our local server. On the third variant, first we create our raw URL by using URL string and also we're using our parameter path. Because when we will make our POST request by using our local server, we will be using different path. And then we're using this path. How you can see our path here. We put this path to our URL. Next, we create our URL components by using our URL component and raw URL. Next, we create our URL from our URL component. And we have an error, we throw an error. When we don't have an error, we return our URL. And also, how you can see, in this variant, we don't require create URL component because we don't make any additional setup to our URL by using URL component. But if you want to add a new setup to your URL by using URL component, you need this line of code for setup your URL. For example, you can add path to this URL by using URL component. If you don't use URL component, you can delete this line of code and use it simply this URL. On the end, we make our URL from our URL component and we have an error, we throw an error. If we don't have an error, we return our URL. Because our function MyRequestURL must return URL or throw an error. Okay, this is our method for make our GET request. How you can see, I create a method user GET request as generic. I create this function with using generic. Generic give our function flexibility for using with different type, depending of our goal. How you can see, our function take one parameter, what we set differently when we run our function. Our type of value must be codable, and then when we run our function, how you can see, we must set this type of value, and also we must set another parameter, URL type. We will be using this parameter when we make our MyRequestURL. When we will make our GET request, we must set our type of value, what we want to return. That means this type of value we will be get from our web IP and decode this data and display this data in our application. How you can see, we'll be using this type of data when we'll be decoding our data. How you can see, inside this function, first we create our URL by using our MyRequestURL method. How you can see, we use it URL type, and then we check. When we have an error, we throw an error. When we don't have an error, we create our URL from our temp URL. How you can see, we assign this URL to our temp URL property, and then we check this URL and set this value to our URL. Next, we try to create our URL request. we try to create our URL request by using our URL. We set our HTTP method to get, but it's optional. When we don't set our HTTP method to get, by default it will be getRequest. We add value to our request. Next, we try to make our getRequest. How you can see, we use try await and using our await function data for request. And we make our request. If we have an error, we throw an error. If we don't have an error, we check our response. If we don't have a response, we return an error. And then we check value what holds our response status code. If our value is placed inside range of value 200 to 299. If our value not inside this range of value, that means we have an error. But we also can check our data, because our data can hold error message. And then we throw an error with value of status code. Next, we create our decoder, and then we try to decode our data, what we take from our web IP. How you can see, for decode our data, I use a type of data, what we set when we run our function. How you can see, when we create this function, I tap this data. And when we run this function, will be set type of this value. And next, we try to decode our data by using decoder and also by using data what we take from our web IP, and we use type of data what we want to create from our data what we take from our web IP. Type of the data we must set when we will be run our method. How you can see, when we will be run this method, we must set this type of data what we want to use it when we will be decoding our data what will be take from our web IP. For example, when we will be set type of data users, that means we will decode our data for type of data users.self. And next, if all successful, we return our response and also we return our users what will be taken from our URL. In this example, more correct will be not set users, because we will be take different type of value. In this example, item will be more correct, because we can decode different type of data, and our property will be hold different type of data. This property can hold user, array of users, for example, page or array of page. And when we have an error, we throw an error. Next, how you can see, I create another method for create our post request. Name of my method, UserPOSTRequest async await generic. This method takes two type of parameters, type T and type R. Type T will be using for input type, and type R will be using for return type of value. And also, we take parameters URL type by using value from our type of app URL enum, and also we will using user form value this parameter must be type of T, and also using path of string. T and R must be codable, because will be encoded and decoded this value. Next, in our method, we create our URL. First, we create our temp URL, then we using our temp URL and using our method MyAppViewModel. And also inside this method we put our URL type, where we take from our parameter. And also we put the path for our URL. And then we check if we have an URL. If we don't have an URL, we throw an error. If we have URL, we move to our make request. How you can see, we're using our URL for make our URL request. We set our HTTP method to post. We must set to post if we want to create a post request. Also, we add value to our request. Next, we create JSON encoder for encoding our data. Then we use a to-try catch block for encoding our data. How you can see, we tried our encoder to encode our user for data. That means we try to encode this data, and then we will send this data to our server. And then server will be check this data and send some data back. How you can see, we try to encode this data, and if our encoder not successful, we throw an error. If our encoder is successful, we set our HTTP body to our request. How you can see, we take request HTTP body equal our HTTP, what we take when we encode our user form data. Next, after we create our URL and also after we create our request and set HTTP body to our request, we try to run our request. How you can see, we use it. Try await URLSession.char data for. This function is await. That means we using try await for run this function. And then we using our request what we create previously for make our post request from our API. Next, we check our response. If we have an error, we throw an error. And then, like in previously, in getRequest, we check our status code. if value of our status code contains in range of value from 200 to 299, it's okay. If our value don't contain inside this range of value, we throw an error. But because we throw an error, we check our data, because our data can hold message error. But if all successful, we move to the next step. Next step, to decode our data, what we take when we make our GET request. How you can see, we try to decode this data. That means if our request is successful, because if our request not successful, this method throw an error. And if our request is successful, and this step and this step also successful, we move to the last step to decode our data. We create our decoder, and then we use a two-try catch block to decode our data. How you can see, we use a try decoder and decode our data to our type of value. This type of value will be set when we will be run our post request. How you can see, when we run this value, we will be set this type of value what we want to return. That means this type of value we will be decoded. This type of value will be encoded and sent to our server. And when we try to decode our data, and if our decoder is not successful, we throw an error. If our decoder is successful, we return our response, and also we return our value, receive user. But in this example, we can also check this name, because in this example, we can return not only user, we can return different type of value, user, page, or another type of value what we put in our R type of value. I said previously user because most work in this project will be work with user object, and also will be work with page object. But with our PostgreSQL method and with our getRequest method, we can get and post different type of value. Because when we create our PostgreSQL method and getRequest method, we use generic. That means we can put different type of value, what we want to set and what we want to get. This is our NetworkRequestService class. In this class, we will make our getRequest and also we will make our PostgreSQL. Later, I also will explain how our method for make getRequest and for my PostgreSQL work. Next, I want to create a view model and also I want to create a view, which gives us ability for make our getRequest and also for make our PostgreSQL and display our data in our application. And after I create view model and view, I try to explain how it all works. For example, And now I want to explain what I create. First, let's move to our extension. How you can see, I create an extension for string value. With this extension, we will make capitalizing first letter of our string value. Next, move to our ViewModel. This is our ViewModel, MyAppViewModel class. This ViewModel we will make our GetRequest and also we will make our PostgreSQL. And now let's see what I create inside this ViewModel. Inside this ViewModel, I create couple property and also I create couple methods. Let's see our property. First property is our type of search. With this property, I using our type of search enum. This property will be using when we will make our GetRequest and also PostgreSQL with our local server. Later, I show you we'll be using this property. Next property, all users. This property will be hold array of user objects, what we will be get from our local server and database. Next property, main page. This property will be hold page object, what we will be get from our web IP. Next, we have property for create and update our user object. First, our property is user's ID. This property will be hold our ID. And also, we set this set for check if our user ID property will be hold a number. And also, we have property for first name, last name, email, and avatar. Next, we have our method. First method, set user for update. This method will be update our users. Later, when we will be update our user, I show you how this method works. Second, we have a two similar methods. With this method, we dismiss a button for search specific user because we must set for user ID or first name for search our user by user ID or first name value. And also, second method will be using when we will be create a new object. That means we must set value when we want to create a new object. Next method will be used for clean our property for create and update our user object. How you can see, we set empty string for our value and also we set type of search, or that means we don't search anything. Next two methods also similar. First method we clean our all user array. Next method we clean our page object. Next method cancel search user. With this method we want to cancel search. That means we don't want search anything. How you can see, with this method we run all user get request async away method. That means with this method we will be get all user objects. When I will be run our simulator and localhost, I show you how this method works. Next method, make tree. With this method, we will be delete a space and new line from our string value. Next method, create a new user. With this method, we will be create a new user and return a new user object. We create a new user by using make trim. That means we delete a space and new line from our string value from our property. Will hold our ViewModel, last name, email, avatar, and on the end, from this value, we create our new user object and return this object. Next method, sort list of user by ID. With this method, we will sort our list of user object by ID. How you can see, our list will be start from low value to high value. Next method, delete item. With this method, we will delete user object from our user object array, what we take from our localhost and database. How all it works, I explain later, because before I want to explain this method, I must explain each method what we use inside delete method. All this method I create below. And now we have our method for make our get request and also for make our post request. First method is take all user objects from our local server. How you can see, we create this method. We make this method main actor because on the end we will set our value to all user array. And this array will be displayed in our application. That means we must set this value to our all user array on the main thread. Inside this method, we use two try catch block. Inside two try catch block, we try away our method from our NetworkRequestServices. How you can see, we make NetworkRequestService.share.user-getRequest async away generic. And how you can see, we set return type user.self, array of user object. That means we want to decode the array of user object what we take from our local host. Now move to our user-getRequestAway method. How you can see, when we set array of user object to our return value, that means we'll be using this type of value when we will be decoding our data what we take from our local host server. And also we set URL type getRequest localhost IP. We're using this type for make our getRequest localhost IP. How you can see, for this I'm using this method, make request, and set this type of URL. For make all users from our localhost I'm using this getRequest localhost IP. That means I will take all users. I will create this URL. And next, if our request is successful, we assign value to our all user property. We'll hold our view model, and then we'll be display this array of user objects in our application. Next, we also print our response status code, and at the end we clean our new user and update user field. And when we have an error, because when we run our request, our method can throw an error, because how you can see, we're using try. This means our method user-getRequest can throw an error. And when this method throw an error, we take this error and print this error. With this method, we will take all user objects from our local server and database. Let's move to the next method. Our next method is make getRequest from our web IP, from our request IP. We will make getRequest from this IP. We make this getRequest list of users. We will take this data and display this list of user data and also this information about this page and support. We must make this getRequest. And now you can see our method also make main actor, because on the end we will set this value to our main page property and will be display data from this property in our application. That means when we set this value to our main page property, we must return to the main thread. Inside our method, we use two try catch block. Inside our two block, how you can see, we try to make our getRequest. We use try await and use it and run our method from our NetworkRequestServices class. How you can see, we use share.user-getRequest async away generic and set for return type we set a page. How you can see, for this method and also for take all users from our local host, we use the same method, but we set a different type of value. In this example, we use an array of user objects. In this, we using page. This means, in this example, we want to take and decode the value of array of user object. But in this example, we want to take from our web IP and decode the value type of page object. And also, how you can see, I set URL type getRequest request IP. That means we will make URL for this request for our request IP. And now move to our user getRequest away. How you can see, when we assign to return type our page type, we will decode this type of value on the end of our method and return this value from our method. Our item property must hold value of page object. When we set for return type it page.self. And if our request is not successful, we throw an error. That means we take this error and print our error. If our request is successful, we take value from our request and assign value from our main page. How you can see, will be returned page object and we assign this page object to our main page property will hold our view model. At the end, we print our response status code and also we clean our property for create a new and update a user field. Let's move to the next method. Next method I create for work with our local host and database. First method is run select SingleUserPOSTRequest. That means this method will be run post request. With this method we will select a single user from our database. How you can see, we set our method main actor for return to the main thread, and also inside this method we use it to try catch block. First we create a new user. This new user will be called user what we want to select. That means what we want to find and return from our localhost and database to our application. And next we try to make our request. How you can see, we run our method from our NetworkRequest tab .shared.userPOSTRequest as await and generic. And also, how you can see, we set input type user.self. That means input type, this is user, what we want to sort. This type means what type of value we want to set to our localhost. This example, how you can see, will be set value of user object. Will be encoded this value and set to our localhost server. And also we have return type user.self. Return type means what type of value we want to take from our localhost and decode this value and display this value in our application. As example, we set also user.self because we want to select single user. URL, what we want to create, we set PostgreSQL localhost IP. User form, this is our user, what we want to find. We set this user, type of this user must be input type. Path is the end of our URL. This end of URL I also show you in our localhost. And on the end, if our request is not successful, we take an error, we throw an error. If our request is successful, we clean our old user array and append the single user to our old user array. This means our old user array will be displayed our user what we find. That means our old user array will be called our single user what we found. Or if we don't found, we don't display any user. Our old user array will be empty. Okay, let's move to the next method. Next method is also select user from our localhost and database. But in this example, we want to find a multiple user with similar first name, for example. Our method also main act, and then we use it to track each block. How you can see, we create a new user. This new user is user what we want to find, and then we try to run our request. How you can see, we using our method from our network server, and then we using the same method like in previously example, UserPOSTRequest as await generic. But in this example, our input type the same, user.self, but our return type is not the same. In this example, we have array of user objects, because in this example, we want to return array of user objects. We also set for create our URL, post request, localhost IP, our user form, user what we want to search, and end of our URL path select. This example will be select. In previously, select single. Now move to our method from our NetworkRequestServices. In previously two methods, we set input type user.self. This means our input type will be user, but our return type, in first example, user.self. In second example, is array of user object. This means we'll be using array of user object type for decode our data, what we take when we will make our GET request. When our request is successful and we have our data, we'll be decode our data, and for decode, we'll be using our R type. That means we'll be using, first example, user.self, in second example, array of user object.self. And also, if we have an error, we take this error and print this error. In this example and in this example. Next method I also create for work with our local server and database. With this method, we'll be insert a new value. That means we'll be add a new value to our database. Our method also main actor, and inside our method run insert new user. We also use it to track each block, create a new user. This property will be called a new user, what we want to add to our database. And also we try to make our request. In this example, we using the same method, UserPOSTRequest as on copy. Input method also the same, like in previously two example, user.self, but in this example, return type is int. Because in this example, when we make our new user, will be return ID of user what we create. And this ID will be int. That means on the end, if our request is successful, our local server will be return ID user what we create. On the end will be print this ID. We set for input type user, because we will add a new user to our database, for return type int. ID for last user what we create. And also we set our URL type for create, URL for our request, user form is our new user, and path new user. This is path will be end of our URL for create our new user. And also, when we have an error, our method throws an error, and we take this error and print this error. With next method will be update our user object in our database. How you can see, we create our method also main actor, and then we create our method run update user post request async generic. Inside this method we use also two catch block. First we create our new user. This user what we want to update. That means this new user object will behold information what we want to update in our database. Later in our local server I show you how this user will be updated, and then will be make our request. How you can see, this example we're also using the same user post request async generic. Input type the same user as well, because we will be send our user object what we want to update, and return type also in. In this example, our method must also return ID of user what we update, because in this example server also must return number of ID of user what we update. Also we set URL type, user form, that's our user object, and path for end of our URL update. And when we run our request and we throw an error, we take this error and print this error. If we don't have an error, we print our last update ID, and also we print our status code. In this example, we don't display this information in our application, in our screen, but we can also display this information in our screen if we want. If we don't display this information in our screen, we don't make our function main actor. But I create this main actor because later, if you want to display data in your screen, in your application, and display the data in screen, we don't have an error, because this method returns to the main thread. That means when we will be displaying this data on the main screen, our method on the end will be returned on the main thread. And our next method is run to delete user post request async away. With this method will be delete a user object from our database. How you can see, I create this method, and this method take one parameter, delete user, because we'll be using this method with our for each structure when we will be displaying our list, and will be put inside our delete object, and then when we want to delete specific user from our list, we will send this specific user to our method. And then, how you can see, I also use it to catch block for make our request. In this example, I use the same method, user post request async away. Input type the same user, because we will send user what we want to delete. Return type is ID. Return type is in that cell, because this method will be return ID of user what we delete. We also set URL type post request localhost IP, and also we set our user form delete user. This is our delete user what we want to delete, and path will be delete. And when we have an error, we print this error. If we don't have an error, we print our delete user ID, and also we print our responsive status code. And now I show you all methods what we will be using when we will be make our GET request, and POST request is our local server, and also with our web IP. And now let's see our method for delete item. This method will be using with list of user objects what we take from our localhost. Our delete item method take array of index of users what we want to delete. Then we select a user from our all user array, and the end our select user property will behold array of user what we want to delete. And then we go through all user what we want to delete and check type of our search. And then we use a switch of our type of search. Why? Because, for example, when we try to find a user for specific name, and we found couple users with the same name, for example, 3 or 4 users, and try to delete one user from this list, that means, for example, we have 3 users with the same name, and then we delete one user from this list, that means we have 2 users with the same name. And that means when we try to search a multiple user, that means our value of search will be multiple search. And when we tap to delete one user from this list of 3 users, we delete this user, and then we run our post request for multiple search. That means on the end, when we delete user from this list, will be search again user with the same name what we searched previously. That means when we have a 3 user and delete one user, And then after we delete, we will have list of 2 users what we have previously. Because 1 user we delete. Previously we had 3 users. If we have search a 1 user, we run delete this user, and also on the end we run our search a single user. If we delete this user, our list will be empty. And when we don't search any user, that means we want to delete a specific user from the list of users what we take from our database. We run delete this user method, and then we run our allUserGetRequest method. That means we take all users from our database what we hold without any search parameters. This is our delete item. This method will be work with our for each structure in our application. Later, with simulator, I show you how it all works. Okay, I show you UModel and property and method inside our UModel. Next, I want to show you view. View I will be show you with simulator. For example, when we run our simulator, first what we have is our main content view. This is our main content view with 2 navigation links to our UsersView with text, user get post request and localhost, and also to our PageView with text get request and request IP. First, I want to show you how you can make get request with page request from web IP. Web IP will be our request IP. For example, when we tap to this link, we move to our page view. This is our page view. How you can see, our page view have couple sections. First section is button section. How you can see, this is our button section. Our button section have 2 buttons. First button for run our get request async away generic request IP. That means we will be run our method for make our get request from our web IP. And also we have button clear page field. That means when we tap to this button, we will set our main page empty. Second section is page info section. How you can see, this section will be display info about our page. And also we have support section for display support text and support URL. This is our section. And on the bottom we have our section for display list of users, what called our main page. How you can see, we create a list by user for each structure. Go through all users, what called our main page property. And then we put our user inside our single user view. I create single user view for display each user in our list. This is our single user view. In this view will be displayed our user object. How you can see, we have each tag, and inside each tag we have with tag, and also we have our image. Inside this tag we will be display ID, first name, last name, and email. And as image we create for display our avatar. When we will be run our get request from our web IP, our user object will be hold URL, and through this URL we can download image from our avatar. If our download will be successful, how you can see, if we have an image, we set up our image, and our image will be displayed in our list. But when we will be download our list of users from our localhost, our user object don't will be hold URL for download image. That means our case successful don't be run. We will be have another case. And for another case, we set to display our avatar. Our avatar will be emoji. How you can see, we're using tag for display our emoji, and also we're using setup for our emoji. How you can see, I create modifier for avatar. This is our view modifier. I create modifier, then I create extension, and then through emoji avatar style, I can run this modifier for our avatar. This means, or we will be download image by URL what hold our avatar value, or we will be display emoji what will be hold our user object what will be downloaded from localhost server. Okay, this is what our single user view. And now, when I tap to this button, get page request, we must make a get request from our web IP. We will make our get request from this IP, request IP. And also, how you can see, I will be make our get request for list of users, and we will be display this data. This data is will be list of our user object, and also we have support. And now, when we tap to this button, we must display this information in our application. For example, when we tap to this button, we display this data in our application. We have page, we have info about our page, also we have section support, and also we have a data, our list of users. And how you can see, for avatar, our data have URL, and we download this image from this URL and display this image in our application. This means our GET request work correctly. When you tap to this button, Get Make Request IP, I run this method. This method runs our method from our NetworkRequestService. This method takes return type of page cell. This means will be decoded page object. And also we have URL type get request request IP for create URL for make request from web IP. And then we assign value after our request to our main page in our ViewModel. And when we assign value to our main page property in our ViewModel, we display this data in our application. This is our method for make our get request. How you can see, we set value page and we decode a data what we take when we use our request and decode this data by using our tself. Tself in this example is page.self. How you can see, this is method user get request async away using generic. This T type can be any type what we want. In this example, our type is page. But then, when we'll be run this application and using our get request by using our localhost, this type will be set to array of user object because will be take all user will hold our database. Our database will be hold array of user object, not page object. Now when we tap clean page field, that means will be clean our main page property. How you can see, all empty. And now when we tap again, we display the data again. Okay, I show you PageView and how you can make GET request from web IP by using async away method and generic. Next, I want to show you how you can make GET request and also how you can make POST request by using async away and generic with localhost server and different database. For example, and also I want to make some change in this project. I want to change function what will be make a POST request for take a single user from our database. For example, and now I want to explain what I'm changing. How you can see inside our function, this function make a POST request for find a single user from our database. This function works with the local server. And then when we return our user, we check ID of user what we return. Because when we try to find a specific user in our database and we don't find a specific user of our database, our local server returns empty user. This empty user will have ID 0. And we check if our user what we take from our server have ID 0, that means we don't find any user. And we assign empty array to our all users array what we display in our application. But if our ID not 0, that means we return not empty user. And how you can see, first we clean our all user array what we hold in our application, and then we put our user what we take from our local server to our all users array. That means we will display this user in our application. And now I want to run our IS project and also I want to run our Golang project and show you how it all works together. First, we will work with SQLite database. First, I must run our simulator and also I want to run our Golang project. For example, and now you can see I run a Golang project and also I run a simulator. We have our main content view. This is our main content view. Now we have a two links for work with our localhost and also for work with our request IP. About work with this IP, I explained previously. And now let's move to our link for work with our localhost, to our UserView. For example, now we move to our UserView. Our UserView have a couple sections. Section for find a user or find a couple users from our database, and also section for get all users from our database, and also section for display a list of users will hold our database. And now, for select all users from our database, we must tap to this button, get all users and localhost. How you can see, when we tap to this button, we'll be run this function, run all users get request func away. And now move to this function. And now I tap to this button, and we must display users what we hold in our database. How you can see, we display to users we hold our database with name, first name, last name, email, and avatar. This user we display after we run our function, run all users get request func away generic and localhost. Let's move to this function and see what this function works. How you can see, this function run function from our NetworkRequestService class. How you can see, inside our NetworkRequestService class, we have function user get request func away generic. With this function, we will make our get request from our localhost. How you can see, this function take return type user self because our function is generic. That means we can use this function with different types. How you can see, we set our return type user. That means when we will make our get request, will be taken from our localhost array of user objects. This means we will make our get request to our local server, and our local server will send data back. And when we decode our data, what we take from our local server, our data must be array of user objects. And also, how you can see, we set URL type get request localhost IP. In this example, we use our enum. We set our URL type for create our URL for make our request. In this example, we create URL for make our get request with our localhost. And then, if all successful, we return a two-value responser and input users. And how you can see, then we use our input user constant, sort this value what hold our input user constant, and set this value to our array of user object. This array of user object will be displayed in our application. And also our function return a response. And now move to this function and look what this function was. How you can see, this is our function for make our get request. How you can see, we use it generic. That means we can use this function with different types. This example, we set our return type. That means we will use this type when we will be decoding our data. Our type must be callable because we will be decoding this data in this function. And then how you can see, we create our URL by make our URL request. And also we using our URL type. We using our type of up URL enum. With this enum, we select what type of URL we want to create. In this example, we create type of URL to make our get request for select all user for our database. How you can see, we'll be using this case. We will use this function, check our URL type, and with our case, we will make our get request. This case, for make our request web IP. This case, get request localhost IP. This is our case for make our get request from all users from our database. In this case, we create our URL by using our function makeRequestURL and return this URL. And also, how you can see, to this URL, we add query item user all for make our URL and return this URL on the end. And now we use this URL for make our URL request. We set HTTP method to get, but it's optional. Next, we use our URLSession for make our request. If all successful and we don't have an error, we check our response status code. If all successful in our response status code, we try to decode our data, what we take from our localhost. How you can see, we're using type self. That means we'll be using type of value, what will be type when we will run our function. And then, if all successful and we successful decode our data, we return our data. We return responser and property item. If we have an error, we throw an error. As you can see, when we run this function, return time array of user object self. That means we must take from our localhost data, and the data we must decode it to array of user object. And now let's move to our Golang project. As you can see, in this case, we have this URL. On the end of our URL, we have users. And now move to our Golang project. This is our Golang project. And now, how you can see, for take all users row from our database, we must have on the end of our URL user. And also, this URL also have query item. But in this place, we don't type in a query item. We check query item later. And how you can see our handle function with URL on the end user, run function, select all user requests. And now this is our function for work with our iOS device and also for return data when we make a GET request. How you can see, we check our GET request, we check our query item users all, then we try to run our method select all user for take all user row from our database. How you can see, we use a pointer for change this slice of user object. We check an error, and at the end, if all successful, we try to encode our data and send the data to our application. How you can see, we create an encoder and then we try to encode our data by send our slice of user object. And at the end, we check an error. If we don't have an error, that means we successfully send data to our iOS device. When we send this data to iOS device, manually see this function. How you can see, this function run query select from users. This query will be select all users row from our database. If all successful, from each row from our database, we create a new user and apply this user to our all user array. And then we use this all user line to send this line to our iOS device. And then after we send this line to our iOS device, we must take this data when we run this our URL session, our request. That means, after moving this request, if all successful, we take this data slice of user object. At the end, we try to decode our data by using decoder and return this data to our application. How you can see, we using decoder, decode this data, what we take from our local host, and return this data. At the end, if all successful, and we return our array of user object, we assign this array of user object to our all user property, what we display in our application. We display array of user object by using MyAppViewModel all user array. This array we use it in our function. And also, this is data what we now display in our iOS device. This data we put in our database previously when we run our Golang project. And also, how you can see, we can create a new user and put in our database. When we tap to plus, we run our new users view. We create first name, last name, email, and avatar. We don't create ID because we create ID in our database automatically. And now create a new user. I type in first name, last name, email, and avatar. And now, how you can see, I try to create a new user object. When I tap to create this user, on the end we have our new user, Mary, last name L, email, test, gmail.com, and this is our avatar. When we tap to this button, I run insertNewUserPOSTRequest as LocalHost generic. Let's move to this function. Now you can see, in this function, we try to create a new user and send to our local host for create our user in our database. Inside this function, we run our function UserPOSTRequest as LocalHost. This function works directly with our local host. And also, how you can see, return type is int. Our return type is int, will be return ID of row what we create. And also we set URL type for post request localhost IP. And also we have our user form new user. This is our data what will be sent to our local host. And path on the end of our URL will be new user. And now move to this function. How you can see, I will use this function to make our post request couple times. How you can see, in this time our function take a two type. Two type will be generic. First type for input type and also for return type. And also we have our type of URL for make our URL. And also type for user form will be input type. On the end will be returned our URL response and value of return type. We also make our request URL like in previous example. Then we try to make our request by using URL request. We set our HTTP method to post. In this example, we must set our HTTP method to post. At the end, we try to encode the data what we want to set to our local server. As you can see, we try to encode our user form. This is form what we create when we fill field in our new users view. If all successful and we don't have an error, we try to make our request with our data what we send to our Golang project. And also we make our request. And then, if we don't have an error, and also when we check our status code, that means all successful, we try to decode the data what we take from our local server. Return type. In this example, will be int. Int is ID of row from our database. If all successful, we return our value of responser, and also this item will be our ID of row what we create. And now move to our Golang project. As you can see, path our new user. And now, as you can see, our path new user will be run function insertNewUserPOSTRequest. In this function, we create our new user row in our database. As you can see, this function checks if we have a post request. And then we try to decode our data, what we take from our IS device. As you can see, we use our request body and we use our new user variables for send the data to this variable. We check an error and then we run our insert new user row. This function works directly with our database. Let's move to this function. And now you can see our function take our new user what we want to put to our database, and return ID of user what we create, and error if we have an error. And then, as you can see, we try to insert into user first name, last name, email, and avatar. This is value what we put when we execute our prepare statement. And on the end, we commit our transaction if we don't have an error. Okay, this was a function for creating user in our database. And next, we also can find a user or couple user in our database. Let's try to find a single user. For example, Rona. As you can see, when I tap find single user, I found this user Rona. And also, we can find user by ID. As you can see, by ID 3, we have user Tom. And also, we can find a couple user. For example, when we have a couple user with the same name. For example, here you can see I try to create a user Tom. We have a two user with first name Tom with ID 5 and ID 3. And now try to find couple user with first name Tom. We try to find single user with ID 3, we have a Tom. Multiple user, we have a Tom with ID 3, and also we have a Tom with ID 5. And now let's see what function work when we try to find a single user and multiple users. Now you can see when we try to find a single user, we run our function run select SingleUserPOSTRequest. And also when we try to find a multiple user, we run select multiple-user-POSTRequest. Let's see how work these two functions. And also we assign a tab search. We assign a tab search, for example, when we select a couple user and try to update a one user from couple what we found, and after we update this user and return back, our type search mean will be searched again all user what we found previously, and we will be see our user what we searched previously. For example, if we previously search a one user, after update this user, we will be see this user. If we previously try to find a multiple user, when we return, we will be see a multiple user what we tried to find previously. And now let's move to our function. As you can see with this function, we run our function from our user post request async await generic. This function will be select a single user from our database. And also for make our URL, we make our post request localhost ID. And also for part, we have a select single. And also we have a similar function, but with this function, we try to select couple user from our database. For example, we run our user post request async await generic. And also our return type is array of user object because we try to select couple user object, and our path is select. Okay, let's move to this function. As you can see, this is our generic. This example, like it previously, we use this function to make our post request in generic. But in this example, we assign another type. But as you can see, in this example, we also use our function user post request async await and generic. Because we'll be using this function when we make our new user. But in this example, input type we set user because we'll be set a user for find a new user. And for return type, in this example, we have user also. Because we will send back from our local host user what we select when we try to find this user in our database. And also we have a different path, single user. But when we run our function for select multiple rows from our database, how we can see our input type user also, because this is user will be called information, what we want to find. And then for return type, we have array of user objects, because we will return a couple user of object what we try to find. At the end, we assign our user to our all user array. In this example, we append a new user to our all user array. And how you can see, I previously created our array is empty. That means when we found one user, will be displayed a one user in our application. In this example, we have path select single. In next example, we have path select. Let's move to our Golang project. How you can see, there is a path select for select multiple row from our database and select single for select single row from our database. With this function, we will select a couple rows from our database. We check our post request, then we try to decode our data, what we take from our IO device. If our decoder is successful, we take this data and also we take our slice of user object and send the data to our select user row. This function works with our database. With this function, we try to select row from our database. And now let's move to this function. As you can see, this function take context and also search user. This variable hold user what we want to find and also all selected user. This line of user what we found a user in our database. How you can see, by using our context, query context and select user by using ID or first name. In this example, we try to find our user by ID or first name. We check an error and then we go through all rows what we take from our database and create a new user for each row and then append this user to our slice of user object. At the end, we try to commit our transaction. And also, next function for select a single row. For select a single row, I have a two variant. First variant not work correctly. I explained previously why. Because I will be using a second variable. The second variable first will be go through all rows by find our user by ID, and then if we don't find our user, we will find user by first name. As you can see, we created two prepare statements. Then we try to find user by ID. By using our prepare statement ID, query row, data, what we want to find, scan, with value to our selected user. And when we don't find a user, we try to run query item from our prepare statement to find our user by first name. And this is the same. We try to assign value to our selected user. At the end, we check an error and return an error or nil for error when we don't have an error. And at the end, if all successful, we return our selected user and nil for error. As you can see, for select single row from our database, I'm using a second variant, select single row and ID. With second variant, we will search first through all users by ID and then by first name. And then, how you can see, this is the function when we found our user or don't found our user. That means our found user will be empty. We try to encode this data by using our found username and send the data to our iOS device. In this example, we try to send our user object, and then in iOS device will be decoded this user object and display in our application. When we select a couple users and we found our user or don't found our user, we will be encoded our all selected user slice and send the slice to our application. If we don't find any user, this means we'll be encoded empty slice. And then in our iOS device we'll be have our empty array. On the end, if we don't have an error, that means we successfully encode our data and send to our iOS device. And then after we make our request, our property input users will be hold our array of user objects. And then we send this array to our all user array. With single user, the same. If all successful, our single user will be hold our user what we want to find. And then, how you can see, we append this user to our all user array. And also, how you can see, we can delete user from our database, and also we can update our user in our database. For example, we have a list of our users from our database. when we want to update our user, we can simply tap on our user. For example, we want to update user Mary. When we tap to this user, we have our ID, we can change ID, we can change first name, last name, email, and avatar. Let's try change last name. We tap in last name, and now when we tap to update, we'll be update this user with ID 4. For example, as you can see, ID 4 we have a last name. Let's see what function we run when we try to update our user. When we try to update our user, we run function run updateUserPOSTRequest async await and generic. As you can see, after we update our user, we use our type of search. I use this as type of search. For example, when we found a couple users with the same name and update one user, and after update, we check if we before update search any user. If we search any user, we try to again search all these users what we searched before we update. Next on the simulator, I'll show you how it works. And now let's see how works this function. I can see this function also runs our UserPOSTRequest async await generic. Our input type user, because we want to update user object, return type int value in this example will be number of row what we update. URL type PostgreSQL localhost IP and path update. And now let's move to this function. This is generic. We see the generic previously. This generic we create our request and then we try to encode this data, send the data by using our post request, and at the end we try to decode our data what we take from our local host and return the data with response. Let's move to our Golang project. Our path update. As you can see on Golang project path update, we run function updateUserPOSTRequest. This is our function what we run for update our user in our database. In this function, first we check if we have a post request. Then our variables update user will behold our user what we want to update when we decode our data from our request body. We create our new decoder by using our request body, and then we try to decode it and put this data from our request body to our update user variable. Then we check an error. If all successful and we successfully decode our data, we try to update our user row in our database by using our function updateUserRow and put in our function updateUser what we want to update. Let's move to this function. As you can see, this function we use transaction, and then we create our prepare statement for update our user in set first name, last name, email, and avatar, because ID we can change. We'll be update our user by ID. If all successful and we don't have an error, we try to execute our prepare statement by using our value from our update user. Last value is our update user ID. By ID, our database will be update our user's row. And next, we check an error. If all successful, we check row affected. That means how many rows we update in our database. If we have a 0, that means we update 0 row. And then we check an error. If we have an error, we rollback for break our transaction and return 0, that means we don't update any row and error. And also, we have a 0, that means we don't update any row. We use it rollback, break our transaction, and return 0, that means we don't update any row. But if all successful and our row affected is not 0, we use it to commit our transaction. If we don't have an error, that means all successful and we update our user. And then, if we successful run our function, our result is how many rows we update. If we have an error, we return an error. If we don't have an error, we try to encode our data, what we take from our database, and then we set the data by using our new encoder, encode our result, our number of rows, what we update. And when we don't have an error, that means we successfully update our user and send data to our IS device. As you can see, on the end we print row update at number. Row update number 1. That means we update number 1 row. And also, how you can see, when we create a new user, we create a user with ID 4, with ID 5. And now let's move to the last function. In the last function, we can delete user from our database. For example, I want to delete user with ID 5 top. Swipe and tap to delete. Now, how you can see, we don't have this user. Let's see what function we run when we try to delete our user from our database. As you can see, we use our array of all users, delete, perform our delete item function. Let's move to this function. As you can see, this function takes index of our user. And then by using that index, we found our user what we want to delete. And then we go through all users what we want to delete. And then we try to find user what we want to delete by using our index tag. And then we take our select user. In this project, I will be trying to delete user one in one time. I don't be delete couple users in one time. And then, how you can see, we go through all users what we want to delete. This example, when we delete Tom with ID 5, this means our selected users array will behold one user, Tom with ID 5. And then, by the switch type of search, we try to run our method for delete our user. How you can see, if we have multiple search, single search, and don't run any search. In our example, we don't run any search because we'll be delete our user from all users from our database. We delete our run delete user post request as on command. Main difference in this whole case, first we run the same function for delete our user, how you can see, and we put user what we want to delete. But second function will be run function. For example, when we run multiple search, we will run again our multiple search. If we have a single search, we will run our single search again. And also, if we don't have any search, we will run all users from our database after we delete our user from our database. Let's move to this function. How you can see, this function run function from our NetworkRequestServices. How you can see, our user post request as on command generic. In this example, we put for input type user, for return type int. Return type in this example, how many rows we delete, and also URL type PostgreSQL localhost IP. And on the end, main thing is path. Path is delete. This is our function, what we run each time when we make our post request. For select single user, for select multiple user, for update user, for insert user in our database, we use the same function. Because using generic, we simply set a different type to our function and then work with this type in our function for make our post request. Because in this project, we run couple post request and single get request. I am said about localhost. How you can see, this is function what I used previously. In all cases, what I said previously. With this function, we try to make our post request. We make our URL by make our request URL. Main thing what we change in this function is path, because path for the end will be delete. We'll be using the path in our Golang project. We try to encode our data for make our post request, and then we try to decode the data what we take from our localhost. And now move to our Golang project. How you can see, this is our function, path delete, run function, delete user post request. This function checks if we have a post request. Then we try to decode our data, what we send from our iOS device. This is our user, what we want to delete. And then we set this user to our delete users row. This function works directly with our database. Let's move to this function. How you can see, this function create prepare statement with transaction and then try to execute our prepare method delete from user, where ID will be delete our user by ID, because all rows in our database have unique ID, and our ID all auto increment. Each row what we create, our ID will be bigger previously by one value. For example, when we create with ID 5, then we'll be create row with ID 6, then with ID 7, 8, 9, 10. Each ID will be increment by 1. And then we try to execute. If we have an error, we use a rollback and return an error. Our execute return how many rows we delete from our database. We check our result, error, row affected. This means how many rows we delete from our database. If we have an error, we return an error. If we don't have an error, we try to commit, and if all successful, we return row affected, how many rows we delete, and nil if all successful. If we have an error, we return an error. And then, if all successful, we have a number of rows what we delete. We check an error. If all successful, we try to encode this data and send the data to our iOS device by using new encoder, responsive writer, and then we use new encoder result. And if we don't have an error, that means we successfully delete our user. How you can see, on the end we print user delete head number. How many rows we delete from our database. And now, for example, we have a two row with the same first name. And now you can see we have a two user with the same name, with ID 3 and also with ID 7, with different ID, different last name, and also different avatar. And now, for example, I try to search user with Tom name. Now you can see we found our two users. And now I want to update one user of these two. And after I update this one user, and because our search type will be multiple, we again will be search this user what we searched before we update. For example, we update user with ID 7. Last name, test last name. How you can see, when we update this user, we search again multiple users with ID, first name and last name, and have our update last name. And also we can delete this user. For example, after we delete this user, we have one user with name Tom. Now clean user field. Get all users from localhost. This is our old user. And when we delete user with ID 5 and try to create a new user, our database create ID 6 because ID 5 delete. Okay, in this part of video, I'll try to explain how work our iOS project with our Golang server and SQLite database. And also, I create another two projects for work with MySQL database and also for work with PostgreSQL database. For work with MySQL database and PostgreSQL database, we don't change our iOS project. I will be run our another Golang project, and our iOS project must work like we work with our SQLite database. For example, and now, how you can see, I run our Golang project, this project for work with MySQLite database. And when I tap Get All Users with localhost, we take all user objects from our MySQL database. How you can see, our last name MySQL. That means we take this data, because this data we put in our database. And now, when you try to work to this project, I don't will be explain all functions in our iOS device, because it's very simple. And also, in my Golang project is also all functions very simple. For example, when we create our get all users and also for select single user role or select multiple roles or delete user from our database or create a new user in our database, we'll be using the same URL what I using when I work with SQLite database. How you can see, when we move to our view model and go through function for run our request, for make our get request, we'll be run our function user get request, what we run previously is our SQLite database. And we don't change any value when we work with our MySQL database. Then, for select a single row from our database, our path select single. This path will be using in our Golang project for work with MySQL database. The same function, the same input type, the same return type, and also all the same. I don't change any code in our iOS project when I work with MySQL database, and then when I will be work with PostgreSQL database. Only I have some change in my Golang project. In this example, we have path select. For insert, we have a new user path. For update, we have update. For delete, we have delete. Now move to our Golang project. Now you can see I run the Golang project and we have our path for make our request. User, select single, new user, update and delete. The same path what I'm using when I work with SQLite database. And also this function for work with our database. This function passes inside serveruser.go. This function works with database and also work with our localhost. In this example, the same. For take all user, we make get request, check our get request, and run our function query database user for select all users row from our database. And then when we select all user, we try to encode this data and set this data to our iOS device. Then our function for select couple row from our database. Let's see this function for work with MySQL project. How you can see, this is the same. Select from user. This function is identical when we work with SQLite database. Let's move to the next function. Next function, select couple user from our database. How you can see, we check our post request, then we create our slice of user object, then we create our property, what called user, what we want to find, and then we decode the data, what we take from our device, and then when we will have an error, we run our function, select user's row. Let's move to this function. Inside this function, how you can see, we try to select user by name or ID. We try to select couple users row by name or ID. Create new user for each row and put this user in our all selected user file. On the end, we commit our transaction. Next function to select single. In this example, work with two variants. First variant not work correctly. I use the second variant. Select single user by ID. Let's move to this function. How you can see, in this function, we try to find user first by ID, second by first name. The example, we use query row by found by ID, and then if we don't find our user, we try to find user by first name. And on the end, if all successful, we return our user what we found and nil for error. Then we take our selected user, encoder, create a new encoder, and then encode this user and send to our iOS device. Next function, insertNewUserPOSTRequest. This function is the same. We check our post request, create property for new user what we want to create. Then we decode the data from our request body to our new user property. Then we use insertNewUser row function to work with our database to insert this user to our database. And then, if all successful, we return ID of user what we create. And then we encode this ID and send to our iOS device. Let's move to this function. Inside this function, we create prepare statement to insert first name, last name, email, and avatar to our row, and then we execute our statement by using this value. On the end, we use result plus insert ID, we return ID of last user what we create. At the end, we try to commit. If all successful, we return our ID at nil for error. Function for update, the same. We take user what we want to update, decode the value to our update user variable. Then we run function update user row to work with data one to update this user. Let's move to this function. How we can see, this function update user by ID. And then we execute our prepare statement, and last parameter is our ID of user what we want to update. And on the end, we check an error. If was successful, we return number of row what we update. And on the last function, for delete user, we check an error. We decode data and decode this data to our delete user variables. This variable will be called user what we want to delete. And then if was successful, we run our delete user row for delete user from our database. Let's move to this function. How you can see, inside this function using transaction, create prepare statement for delete from user by ID, run execute our parameter delete user by ID. If we have an error, we return an error. And then we check from affected how many rows we delete from our database. We check an error, and try to commit. If all successful, we return row affected and nil. This is all very similar when we work with SQLite database. Main difference between these two projects, SQLite and MySQL database, is how we open and connect to our database. Because to work with MySQL database, we must create a local server to work with MySQL database. When we work with SQLite database, we don't need a local server to work with SQLite database. And now you can see we can create a new user. So we can see we successfully create a new user. And also we can delete this user. For example, delete user pronoun. And also we can find user by first name. And also, as you can see, we can find couple user with wrong name and can find a single user. Single user will find a first user with a wrong name. Multiple wrong name. We can update, for example. We can delete. And on the end we have the three user objects what we have previously. Our project work with MySQL database, work the similar like we work with SQLite database. And also I have a project for work with PostgreSQL database. And how you can see, I run a Golang project for work with PostgreSQL database. And also we have our IS project. And now I tap to get all user objects from our database. We must see our users row, what we have in our PostgreSQL database. How you can see, we have a 3 object, last name PostgreSQL database. This is data what we put in our database. This is our data. That means our server works correctly. I don't change IS project for work with PostgreSQL database. I have some change in my Golang project for work with PostgreSQL database. In our IS project, we have the same URL, path, and also the same function what we worked previously with SQLite database and also MySQL database. We run the same function. And now move to our Golang project. Main difference between all these projects is how we open our database. Because for work with PostgreSQL database, we also must have our local server. For MySQL database, we must also have local server. For SQLite database, we don't must have local server with database. And after we open and execute our SQL file, we have the same function. For select all users row, for select multiple single users row, insert new user, update user row, delete user from our database. And also we have the same path, delete, select and single, new user, update, and delete. We run the same function for work with our local server and database. Let's move to file what holds this function. How you can see, first function for take all user row from our database with getRequest. This function runs our function for work with database. How you can see, we have select from user. That's all identical like in previously 2 projects. Let's move to the next function. After we successfully select all users, we encode the user and select to our IS device by using our responsive writer and send this data to our IS device. Next, we have select multiple users. All very similar like in previous project. Create context, slice of user object, what we will be sent, try to decode the data what we take from our IS device, check an error. This function works with our database. First we check if we have an error when we work with our selected users row function. If successful, we try to decode the data, we'll hold our all selection, and then we try to encode our variables, we'll hold our user object, and send the data to our IS project. Let's move to function to work with our database. As you can see, this function works with our database. It's very similar like in previous example, but in query we have a different sign. We don't question mark, we have $1 for first parameter, $2 for second parameter. This is different between first 2 projects, because in first 2 projects with SQLite database in MySQL database we use question mark. Then the same, we go through all row from our database, create new user for each row, and put this user to our slice of user object. And as we try to commit. Next we have function for select single user. How you can see, we try to decode the data, what we try to find. And then I create a 2 variables, like in previous example, and I use a second variable for search by ID first and then by first name. If all successful, we try to encode the data what we select and set the data to our IS device. Let's move to this function. As you can see, this function we create per statement for ID and per statement for first name. As you can see, by ID $01 and it's my mistake. And by first name also using 01. If all successful and we don't found by ID, we try found by first name. If we don't found by first name, we return empty selected user. Next function, insert new user. Check a post request, decode the data what we take from our IS project to our variables, then run function for work with our database. As you can see, in this function we try to insert user with value first name, last name, email and avatar, value $0, $2, 3, 4, and return the ID of user what we create. Then we run query row, then we check if error, and if all successful, we return ID of row what we create. If not, we return an error. Then we take this ID and try to encode this data and send to our IS device. For update, the same. Check post request, decode the data what we want to update, run function for work with database. How you can see, with update, we create prepare statement for update user by ID, and then we try to execute our prepare statement and put value what we want to update. At the end, we check row affected, how many rows we update. At the end, we commit. If we are successful, we return how many rows we update. And the last function for delete users row from our database. We check our post request, then decode the data, what we try to delete. Then we run function for work with our database for delete user. If all successful, we return how many rows we delete from our database. How you can see, this function create prepare statement, user by ID, will be delete user by ID, execute, check result, return error. If we don't have an error, we return our row affected and nil for error. Now you can see that's all very similar like in our previously two projects. How you can see, I create a new user, Rona, and then we try to find this user. We have a two user. We can find single user, first user with ID 2, or simply user by ID 3, Tom. We can delete this user. We don't have any user with ID 3. Clean that field. How you can see, we don't have user with ID 3. How you can see, all work very similar like in our previous project by work with SQLite and also by work with MySQL project. This is the end of my video. In this video, I try to show you how you can create IS project for work with Web API and also for work with local server. And also, in this IS project, I show you how you can use it generic for make you GET request and also for make you POST request to your Web API or to your local server. And also, in this video, I try to show you how you can work with SQLite database, MySQL database, and also PostgreSQL database. And also, on description, I put a link where I create Golang project for work with SQL database, MySQL database, and also Golang project for work with PostgreSQL database. This is the end. Thank you for watching.